Hey, oh, let's talk about this. No, wait, no, no!
Headshot.
Hi there. Have you ever noticed that Sega's classic gun game, House of the Dead, is astonishingly similar to Capcom's Resident Evil? Well, I have. Both games were released in 1996. Resident Evil came out in March, and the House of the Dead would show up 6 months later in Japanese arcades on September 13th, 1996. In terms of gameplay mechanics, they aren't all that similar. House of the Dead is a light gun-based gallery shooter that was built upon the same game engine as Virtua Cop. Like Virtua Cop, it was a successful attempt at increasing the cinematic immersiveness of gallery shooters by implementing constantly changing 3D environments. Resident Evil, on the other hand, is an early example of what was essentially a brand new genre, the survival horror game. Resident Evil is far from the first example of such a game. It was actually based on an early survival horror game for the Famicom called Sweet Home, and its mechanics were based on Infogrames' 1992 survival horror Alone in the Dark. Yet Resident Evil's mix of clunky combat, clumsy tank controls, and constantly backtracking through spooky pre-rendered backgrounds in order to complete what amounted to being a very long scavenger hunt had by far the largest influence on all future games of the genre. And just like House of the Dead, Resident Evil is an early example of 2D game developers venturing forth into a new world of 3D polygonal characters. Along with acquiring a new dimension of movement and depth, game developers at the time were also struggling, quite painfully at times, to make their creations more like movies. Like, a lot more like movies. Games like Final Fantasy VII and Metal Gear Solid weren't just rife with movie references, but they were full-blown attempts at merging the interactivity of video games with the spectacle of Hollywood. Completely. And while storylines for games were more or less blown off entirely in the 80s and early 90s, frequently being reduced to nothing more than a silly paragraph in the user's manual, games in the next generation were striving to be a lot more. And it's with regard to the storyline that we find the similarities between Resident Evil and House of the Dead to be simply amazing. Even though both games were released in 1996, their respective stories both take place in Future World 1998. Both games take place in a large, spooky, and remote mansion that also turns out to be a secret laboratory. In both games, your main adversary is a host of flesh-eating zombies. And in both games, the best way to dispatch said zombies is with a classic George Romero headshot. In both games, the zombie outbreak is the result of a science experiment gone wrong. And there's nothing supernatural about any of the monsters or scenarios that take place. Everything bad that you encounter in both games is the result of humanity tampering with nature. Also, both games feature lots of references to biology and contain apparatuses such as large wet specimen jars for holding monsters. In both games, the main villain is a megalomaniacal mad scientist who specializes in genetics. And in both games, he is only opposed by American paramilitary agents who respond to the outbreak after receiving a distress signal from their less fortunate associates. In both games, that same megalomaniacal mad scientist villain has created a giant humanoid monster as a central part of his larger plan. In both games, the mad scientist unleashes his creation on the player during the final act by unlocking some kind of holding chamber. In both games, the monster appears to be asymmetrical and incomplete, and both monsters are equipped with long, menacing claws. And then, in both games, once the monster has been freed, it ironically turns on its mad scientist creator, killing them. Though in both games it later turns out that the mad scientist wasn't really dead, at least in the sequels. And in both games, of course, the player is forced to kill the monster as the game's final obstacle, and having beaten the monster, the player will find that they have also beaten the game. The similarities between these two games are astonishing. There is no other pair of video games in existence that I am personally aware of that have this much in common when it comes to the narrative. It's incredible. In its bare structure, at the most fundamental level, what we have here are two games basically telling the same story. So, how did this happen? My first assumption would have been that one game simply imitated the other. Perhaps the developers of House of the Dead were so impressed with Resident Evil that they wanted to recreate it as an action-packed light gun game. But that isn't a possibility. Like I said, both of these games were released in 1996, and they were essentially developed at the same time. Pre-planning for Resident Evil was started as early as 1993, but actual development of the game wouldn't happen until a year later, and even then details about the game were not publicly known for a long time after. By the time the developers of House of the Dead would have seen the game, it would have been too late to change their own story to fit Resident Evil's. Another possibility I thought could have been that during development, the developers were somehow in communication with each other, such that they started to either consciously or unconsciously copy each other. I had this mental image of a bunch of drunken Capcom and SEGA employees hanging out at an izakaya, talking about all of their favorite George Romero zombie movies while singing karaoke. But SEGA is in Tokyo, and Capcom is in Osaka. Even if you took one of Japan's famous bullet trains, these cities are still 2.5 hours away from each other. It's still possible that they shared this information online, but the internet in Japan wasn't really widely or conveniently accessed until the Japanese launch of Windows 95 in November of 1995. That would have been only 4 months before the launch of Resident Evil. House of the Dead was already far into development at that point and would have already had its story outlined. After this, I think the most likely possibility is that House of the Dead and Resident Evil were both somehow inspired by a third source, be a book, a movie, a game, something out there. And believe me, I've spent hours scouring the world of horror, video games, and comics. I asked people on Reddit, who as usual basically just told me to go to hell. But I wasn't able to find anything that was as similar as House of the Dead is to Resident Evil. Nothing that was made before 1996. As far as I can tell, no singular source exists. And yet, these games, made at the exact same time, by completely different people, have so much in common that it cannot just be a coincidence. But after perusing tons of books, comics, games, and movies from the early 90s, 80s, and 70s, media I thought would be freshest in the minds of Japanese game developers in the mid-90s, a pattern began to emerge. And bit by bit, I found imagery and references within various media that when taken all together as a new whole, could shed light on how it was that House of the Dead and Resident Evil wound up with the same basic story structure, without anyone knowing that it was happening. Here's what I think is going on. Steve Jobs once famously said the following about good artists.
I mean, Picasso had a saying, he said, good artists copy, great artists steal.
I think I know what he means. Everyone who's ever made anything creative, be it a story, a painting, or even something as big and complex as a movie, has by necessity engaged in some sort of imitation. It's human nature to either consciously or unconsciously allow our many experiences and influences color not only how we perceive reality, but also how we represent reality through our art. The point of Steve Jobs saying that good artists imitate and great artists steal is that the very best artists are capable not only of discerning the best art that came before them, but that they're also capable of consciously utilizing great art or great ideas in new and interesting ways. The personal computer was already well established in 2007, so was the cell phone, the digital camera, and the personal MP3 player. These things were so common and obvious. What wasn't obvious was that it was possible to combine all of these things together into a single entity in a way that wasn't going to be a horrifying abomination. People imitate, we copy. It's how we all get good at whatever it is we do. And then when we're proficient, we give our work our own personal flair or style. And when we get good enough, we might even innovate. And more often than not, that's achieved by recombining old things into something fantastic and new.
Jason, what are you doing?
One step, Sensei.
This isn't Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do, it's karate. Now get with the program, okay?
Yes, Sensei.
Okay. Everybody, continue.
In 1977, Star Wars was an unprecedented cultural phenomenon of such great magnitude that words can't really do it justice. George Lucas had created a film that resonated with a generation of moviegoers like nothing else before it. He did more than create a movie, he practically created a lifestyle. But Lucas didn't just make up Star Wars. It's fairly common knowledge that the basic story structure for Star Wars was deliberately lifted from Japanese director Akira Kurosawa's samurai adventure film The Hidden Fortress. Have you ever noticed that Darth Vader is basically just Doctor Doom in a samurai helmet? Many other elements from the movie were lifted from Lucas's love for old Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon outer space adventure serials. In fact, that was the basic idea for Star Wars from day one, an homage to a dead genre. But to the kids of the 70s, the whole thing was absolutely fresh. They knew nothing about Japanese samurai movies. They knew nothing about old space adventure serial films. All they knew was that they had just seen something the likes of which had never been seen by anyone in a movie theater before, even though the entire thing was actually comprised of stuff that many people had already seen many times. Good artists imitate, great artists steal. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit in the 1930s, largely as a book to entertain his children. It was popular and eventually followed up by his massive and universally praised sequel, The Lord of the Rings. But Tolkien, an expert in ancient languages and mythology, didn't just start by making up a bunch of fanciful nonsense, but rather he borrowed and reworked elements of the myths that he knew and loved from his own research. Anyone familiar with the Old English epic of Beowulf will recall many elements that are similar to The Hobbit, especially Beowulf's confrontation with an angry dragon that bears conspicuous similarities to Bilbo's confrontation with Smaug. Good artists imitate, great artists steal. The same phenomenon then is being borne out here, in the origins for both House of the Dead and Resident Evil. These guys stole, but it appears to me that they just so happen to steal from a lot of the same sources. This isn't hard for me to believe, because just think about how much the developers of these games had in common. They were Japanese men from the same generation born in the 1960s, working in the exact same creative industry and moving within the exact same cultural and social circles. In the same way that everyone at both Marvel Comics and DC Comics couldn't help but produce similar content, neither could these guys help but do the same. And as we've already discussed, they didn't even have to directly influence or imitate each other. They simply had to be human beings, living in a similar environment and sharing enough of the same cultural influences that came before them. There's no way that I can possibly come up with an exhaustive list of possible creative influences for these games. But at the very least, let's talk about some of the most likely candidates that I did find. First, let's just get the most obvious thing out of the way. It shouldn't need to be stated that George Romero's 1968 horror classic, Night of the Living Dead, is a clear influence here. And not just here, but on everything ever made that features zombies. Night of the Living Dead and Romero's sequels, Day of the Dead and Dawn of the Dead, essentially established the zombie genre, and most of its core principles as we know them. Zombies are murderous reanimated corpses that eat the living, but also with some kind of natural sounding cause such as a special virus or magical radiation. Contact with zombies spreads the infection, and indeed, so infectious are zombies that their presence has a tendency to bring on the end of the world, the so-called zombie apocalypse. And of course there's the popular idea that zombies are best dispatched by taking out their head. All of this came from Romero, and it's an inescapable part of zombie lore not just in House of the Dead and Resident Evil, but in most zombie movies, shows, or media of any form. Thus, while it's worth mentioning, it's also too obvious to really help us because virtually everything with zombies in it has been inspired by Romero's movies. Was House of the Dead and Resident Evil inspired by Night of the Living Dead? Sure, duh, of course it was. Night of the Living Dead practically invented the contemporary concept of the zombie, but outside of this, it has very little in common with these games. Another source worth mentioning, somewhat superficially, is Devilman. Devilman is a very influential Japanese comic book series that was created by Go Nagai in the early 1970s. There is probably hardly a Japanese male born after 1960 and before the year 2000 who hasn't experienced Devilman in some way or fashion. To me, the influence of Devilman on the creature designs for both Tyrant in Resident Evil and the Magician in House of the Dead are unmissable. Well, for Tyrant the similarity is honestly kinda slight. The key thing would be the large humanoid shape and massive claw hands. What sets Tyrant apart are his deformities and the fact that he's covered in internal organs protruding out where they ought not be. He's a lot closer to Frankenstein. The Magician, on the other hand, is plainly a devil. A humanoid with large clawed hands, horns, and more symmetry, though he is also an incomplete creation. He looks exactly like Devilman, in fact, except he's missing wings and a tail. Another superficial influence has to be James Cameron's incredible 1986 movie Aliens. Aliens is a direct sequel to the 1979 sci-fi horror classic Alien, and to say that both of these movies were influential would be a gross understatement. In Aliens, there are two specific scenes that are reminiscent of both Resident Evil and House of the Dead. The humans in the movie have managed to capture an alien facehugger and keep it inside of a wet specimen jar, which of course comes back to haunt the film's protagonist Ripley in a near-death encounter. Presumably, these kinds of wet specimen jar scenes that have monsters that eventually burst forth out of them are a staple of the horror genre, but for the life of me I can't find a single example of this trope existing outside of the Alien franchise. It could be that these images stick to us so strongly that we assume they must be everywhere. Resident Evil has both a monster breaking out of a wet specimen jar and tons of similar lab vessels throughout. House of the Dead, on the other hand, has lots of specimen jars and labs, but nothing bursting out as far as I can remember. And since we're talking about specimens and biology, we really need to address the monster in the room here. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the grandfather of all cautionary tales opposed to amoral scientists playing fast and loose with matters of life and death. And wouldn't you know it, but in 1994, around the same time that Resident Evil started its production cycle, a major Hollywood movie was released that kind of attempted to be true to the spirit of the original source material. Kenneth Branagh directed this mostly panned tragedy about the hubris of a young medical doctor named Victor Frankenstein who is obsessed with discovering the secrets of life and death. Of course, this is a stupid movie based on a novel written in the early 19th century, so the secret to life is basically just blasting stuff with electric eels.
Take that, cell theory! Who are you, entropy? Go to hell, Darwin!
The movie has a few of the critical elements that have informed every story of its kind since Mary Shelley wrote her famous book. Morally blind scientists, giant laboratories, creating life, only to have that life eventually turn on you in an unexpected and terrible way.
I can't help but wonder if the developers of both House of the Dead and Resident Evil had the chance to see this movie during the early production of their respective games.
I have to assume, of course!
But as much as I'm pretty sure they saw Frankenstein, I'm also pretty sure that they were familiar with the Mobile Armored Riot Police, or Ghost in the Shell as it's known in the West, one of the most influential manga ever made. First published in Japan in 1989, Ghost in the Shell is a sometimes comical, sometimes pornographic, but always ultra-violent police drama with a futuristic cyberpunk setting that is painfully rife with technobabble and philosophical musings that range from the completely asinine to the genuinely profound. Ghost in the Shell is as quirky and eclectic as its super aloof, mysterious creator, Masamune Shiro, who very rarely gives interviews and who is maybe, just maybe, a little crazy. As a police drama in a cyberpunk world, there is at first glance very little here in common with either House of the Dead or Resident Evil. However, later in the series, we are introduced to a cybercriminal known as the Puppeteer, who turns out to be an advanced artificial intelligence created by the Japanese government called Project 2501. The imagery of a self-aware creature, in this case a very dangerous AI with an android's body, is reminiscent of both Tyrant and the Magician from House of the Dead, and Frankenstein. You have your laboratory setting. You have your cautionary tale about the dangers of playing God by attempting to create new forms of life. You have your out-of-control humanoid monster that turns on its creators. And of course, the only way to deal with that monster is a futuristic militarized police force. not dissimilar to stars from Resident Evil or AMS from House of the Dead. We've already mentioned Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but an even more likely and culturally proximate descendant of Frankenstein was created by H.P. Lovecraft in the early 1920s. H.P. Lovecraft is an early 20th century American horror author that most people have either never heard of or are completely obsessed with. And quite surprisingly, Lovecraft has long been popular in Japan, appearing as early as the 1940s in Japanese pulp magazines like Hakaba. But Western pencil and paper role-playing games have also long been popular in Japan, and it was the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game that made H.P. Lovecraft's writings well known to modern Japanese audiences. Every now and then, his name or references to his stories will come up in Japanese video games, such as the 1980s arcade game Splatterhouse by Namco. And both House of the Dead and Resident Evil games are participating in Lovecraftian tropes as well, especially as it pertains to a series of short stories about Dr. Herbert West, the Re-Animator. In Lovecraft's story, Herbert West is a sociopathic medical student who develops a chemical compound capable of reanimating the dead. Only, the dead never come back as Herbert West intends, but rather as deranged monsters that behave very much like George Romero's movie zombies. In one story, West reanimates the corpse of a hulking boxer, who winds up going on a murderous, cannibalistic rampage. Eventually, the massive monster, in a moment reminiscent of both Resident Evil and House of the Dead, attacks Dr. West, who has to put it down by unloading every bullet in his revolver. However, the reprieve is short-lived, as a pack of zombies created by his own life serum eventually corner and disembowel him. Is it possible that the developers of House of the Dead and Resident Evil were familiar with this story? Very possible indeed. Another cautionary tale about the dangers of amoral scientists that the developers of these games would have known for sure is 1993's Jurassic Park by Steven Spielberg. Released to movie theaters worldwide in 1993, the same year that director Shinji Mikami would begin a year-long process of pre-planning for Resident Evil, Jurassic Park was a monumental and inescapable moment in film history. Not only did the movie demonstrate the full potential of CGI in movies, with freaking dinosaurs, but it also introduced most of the world to both the science of genetics and the moral quandaries surrounding the possibility of genetic manipulation and cloning. Beyond that, many elements that would eventually be found in both Resident Evil and House of the Dead are here. In a remote laboratory, geneticists seeking to unlock and harness the secrets of life itself have managed to bring the dinosaurs back from extinction. Only instead of being crazy for world domination, these guys are crazy for profit and quality family entertainment. Jurassic Park is supposed to be an amusement park, but nature isn't so easily contained, and soon the dinosaurs turn on the creators and go on a killing spree.
Clever girl.
Could have Jurassic Park's influential condemnation of genetic manipulation influenced the House of the Dead and Resident Evil? It's hard to see how it couldn't have. In the same way that no movie set in space was the same after Star Wars, nothing dealing with genetics or creature creation would ever be able to escape the possibility that whatever you cook up might just turn around and eat you. Also, it can't be a coincidence that Shinji Mikami's next game after Resident Evil would be Dino Crisis, a game that's often described as Resident Evil, but this time with dinosaurs. Also, the velociraptors from that game are completely lifted from the fictional species created for Jurassic Park movies. That similarity is not a coincidence. Talking about Resident Evil director Shinji Mikami, he is often quoted as saying that the zombie films of Lucio Fulci were an inspiration to him, insofar as they were a disappointment, and that he felt like his team at Capcom could do better. Mikami is specifically referring to a movie called Zombie 2, an Italian attempt at a sequel to George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, but both Resident Evil and House of the Dead have far, far more in common with Zombie 3, which came out in 1988. I really think this is probably the Lucio Fulci movie that Shinji Mikami had in mind. Zombie 3 opens with a scene that is very reminiscent of the Birth of Tyrant in Resident Evil. A scientific experiment on the dead in a remote secret laboratory goes wrong, leading to a monster to burst out of its specimen chamber in a violent rage. Eventually, the evil chemical responsible for the abomination gets out of the lab, and infected individuals precipitate the spread of a full-blown zombie outbreak. Military forces are called in to investigate and attempt to quell the ensuing carnage. To be fair, the opening scene has more in common with the classic Frankenstein film or 1985's Re-Animator, which was also based on H.P. Lovecraft's Herbert West stories. But the overarching narrative in this movie is indeed very close to both House of the Dead and Resident Evil, though there are enough differences to dismiss the notion that this is somehow the singular origin for the stories of either game. But Lucio Fulci definitely had an audience in Japan in the 80s, and his movies have been officially cited as a point of influence. Could the creators of House of the Dead and Resident Evil been influenced by Zombie 3? Are people trying to actually cancel Halloween this year? These are the most glaring and likely sources inspiring House of the Dead and Resident Evil that I found. But by no means do I mean to imply that this is an exhaustive account. I doubt that such an account is even possible. And I have not created this video to insinuate in any way that either the creators of House of the Dead or Resident Evil are somehow guilty of plagiarism. Rather, I'm merely offering this as an observation with an explanation. House of the Dead is miraculously similar to Resident Evil, and yet because of the timing of its development, that similarity cannot be attributed to direct, one-to-one imitation, and that's the phenomenon that I find so fascinating. I think as humans, we like to think that we have limitless creative potential. But as this episode highlights, it seems to be the case that what we create is very often, perhaps always, just a product of our human nature and cultural environment. If we asked another team of Japanese game developers to make a game about zombies in 1994, what sort of game would they have made? We'll never know for sure, but I think it is very likely that whatever it was going to be a lot like Resident Evil and House of the Dead. In an interview with Dark Horse Comics in 1995, Masamune Shiro had this to say about striving to create something truly original. Of course, I believe that my work is original in its own way, but there's always some past experience or memory that triggers the ideas I come up with. I may be able to build on ideas to adapt them, and thus come up with something new, but I have doubts about whether it's truly possible for anyone to create something completely new and original. As with cooking, even if the ingredients are the same, the way they are mixed together and the goal of the person doing the mixing creates a different flavor. In that sense, if the result of cooking can be called original, well, so too can my work. I also try to draw manga that are true to myself. These are wise words. We strive to create new works of art that are true to ourselves, and insofar as we reshape our thoughts, experiences, and memories into something new, what we create will naturally reflect that. But at the very same time, we ought to be aware of how much our capacity for originality is curtailed by the fact that so much of what we think, feel, and experience and believe we understand is also shared by thousands, perhaps even millions of people who live lives analogous to our own. That's a humbling thought, and yet at the same time, it's liberating, because it turns out that you don't have to reinvent the wheel to be good at what you do. You're never truly going to be original, because no one human being ever is, and thus, you don't have to be. If you're dealing with writer's block or you don't know what to do for your next creative project, then by all means, just imitate something you admire. Or, if you're really good, just steal from the best and put your own creative spin on it. And, just like everyone else who makes videos on YouTube, I will now say, because it's what I can't help but say, because it's what I need to say, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time. And also, please like and subscribe, and if you like our content, please ring the bell. Namaste.